I still remember that feeling. That quietest moment after Chloe finally moved her last box out. A kind of silence I hadn't realized I was starving for. It was profound. Like the world had just exhaled with me after holding its breath for years. And then, reading that little note she left, "I hope you're happy." I looked around my empty living room, the space finally feeling like mine again, and I thought, yes. Actually, I am. It's funny, because for so long, happiness felt like something I had to constantly justify, had to fight for against a current of subtle, insidious doubt. It started, really, the morning I woke up to a text from Chloe's ex-boyfriend at 6 in the morning. My phone buzzed, and there it was, "Thanks for last night, see," with a little heart emoji. And I was lying right there next to her, in our bed, in my house, just staring at that screen. Sometimes the words that end a marriage, they're not screamed in anger. They're just delivered cold, almost rehearsed, across a kitchen table. It's like someone hands you a piece of paper with the script for the end of your life together, and you just read it. And then you realize, in that moment, that you don't actually get a say. Not in her life, not in what's happening, not in any of it. And that's when you have to make a choice about what you do next. That's what happened to me and Chloe. One night, she looked at me across our kitchen table, her fork was still in her hand, the sesame chicken getting cold, and she just said, "I decide who I spend time with, David. You don't get a say." The way she said it, it wasn't defensive. There was no emotion. It was this chilling, flat tone, like she'd practiced it. Like someone had coached her exactly how to deliver that line. I remember just slowly nodding, setting down my own fork. I said 2 words back. Just 2 words. "Your choice." What she didn't know then, what none of her new friends knew, was that I meant it in a way she wasn't expecting. See, Chloe had changed. Over about 4 months, she just transformed. And I'm not talking about a new haircut or picking up a hobby. This was a complete personality transplant. The woman I married 7 years ago? She would have laughed if someone told her she needed to reclaim her power from her husband. But the woman sitting across from me that night? She was a stranger. It started small, like these things always do. She joined this women's group. The Empowerment Circle, she called it. Said it was just a book club, with wine and conversation. I didn't think much of it at first. Chloe had always been social, always had friends. I never had a problem with that. But this group, this one was different. The leader was a woman named Felicity. Mid-30s, divorced twice, no kids. Ran some kind of life coaching business out of a small, rented office downtown. Chloe came home from that first meeting buzzing. All this talk about independence, self-actualization, toxic patterns in relationships. I figured it was just new vocabulary, buzzwords people pick up when they're trying to sound enlightened. But then the meetings went from once a month to twice a week, then 3 times. And suddenly, Chloe was coming home at 11 at night, smelling like cigarettes and a perfume that wasn't hers. She'd say they'd lost track of time, or talk about boundary setting. I'd ask simple questions, like if she wanted me to save her dinner, or if she needed anything from the store. And she'd snap at me. "Stop trying to control my schedule," she'd say. Or, "I don't need you managing my life." These weren't answers to my questions. They were accusations. And I didn't understand them. One night, I made the mistake of mentioning that I missed spending time with her. "Maybe we could plan a weekend trip, like we used to?" She just stared at me. Like I'd asked her to give up oxygen. "That's exactly what Felicity warned us about," she said. "Partners who try to isolate you from your support system." I wasn't trying to isolate her from anyone. I was trying to have a conversation with my wife. But apparently, wanting your spouse's attention now qualified as emotional abuse. The Empowerment Circle had 3 core members besides Chloe. There was Sarah, who left her husband of 12 years because he asked her to help pay the mortgage after she quit her job to start a jewelry business that never sold a single piece. Then there was Jessica, who was on her third failed engagement, blaming each ex for not supporting her dreams, even though her dreams changed every 6 months. And then, of course, Felicity, the ringleader. She seemed to collect broken marriages like trophies. I met them once. At a restaurant. Chloe insisted we have dinner with the group. Felicity dominated the entire conversation, talking about how women needed to stop dimming their light for men who couldn't handle their brilliance. Sarah nodded along like a bobblehead. Jessica chimed in with stories about her exes that all sounded suspiciously similar. And Chloe? She just sat there, absorbing every word like it was gospel. I tried to engage, tried to be supportive, but every comment I made was met with these condescending smiles. When I mentioned my promotion at work, Felicity cut me off mid-sentence. "That's wonderful, but let's keep the focus on the women tonight," she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I realized then that I wasn't invited to participate. I was invited to be judged. The changes in Chloe accelerated after that dinner. She started dressing differently. "Not for you, for myself," she'd say. Which apparently meant low-cut tops and skirts she'd never worn before. She bought new jewelry, expensive pieces I'd never seen her wear around the house. She stopped texting me during the day, stopped asking about my work. Stopped caring about the little routines we'd built together over 7 years. When I'd get home from work, she'd already be getting ready to leave for another meeting, another girls' night, another empowerment session. I found receipts for bars in her purse, places she'd sworn she'd never been to. One night, I asked her directly if something was going on. If there was something she needed to tell me. She looked at me with such contempt. This is what Felicity said would happen. "You can't handle me being independent, so you're trying to make me feel guilty." I wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. I was trying to understand why my wife was becoming a stranger. But in her mind, guided by Felicity's poison, every question was an attack. Every concern was control. Every attempt to connect was me trying to clip her wings. Here's what I learned during those 4 months. And maybe you've experienced this too, if you've ever watched someone you love get pulled into something toxic. The red flags weren't just the late nights or the new clothes or even the receipts. The real warning sign was how she started rewriting our history. Suddenly, our 7 years together became this narrative of oppression she needed to escape from. Date nights we'd enjoyed became examples of me controlling her time. Decisions we'd made together became proof I'd manipulated her. Our entire marriage got filtered through Felicity's lens until nothing good remained. That night in the kitchen, when she told me I didn't get a say in who she spent time with, something shifted in me. I'd spent 4 months trying to understand, trying to adapt, trying to save something that she was actively destroying. I'd made excuses for the late nights, the distant behavior, the way she talked to me like I was her enemy instead of her partner. But sitting there, watching her eat cold Chinese food with the same hand that used to reach for mine across tables, I realized I was done fighting for someone who didn't want to be fought for. So when I said your choice, I meant it completely. She wanted independence. Wanted freedom from my questions, my concern, my presence. And I was about to give her exactly what she asked for, though not in the way she expected. She smiled at me that night, thinking she'd won some kind of victory, thinking I'd finally learned my place. What she didn't know was that I'd already started making plans. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been scrolling through Instagram late one night when I noticed something odd. Chloe had posted a story geotagged at a bar downtown at 1:45 in the morning. The timestamp was clear. The location was clear. And the lie she told me that night was clear, too, because she'd texted me at midnight saying she was watching movies at Sarah's apartment and heading to bed soon. I took a screenshot, saved it to a folder on my laptop, and started paying closer attention. Over the next 2 weeks, I documented everything. Instagram stories at clubs while she texted me about quiet nights in. Credit card charges for lingerie she never wore around me. Her wedding ring sitting in the bathroom drawer more nights than it was on her finger. Every lie had a timestamp, a receipt, a digital footprint she was too careless to hide. The Thursday night before our kitchen conversation, I'd gone to that bar myself. I sat in a corner, ordered a beer I barely touched, and watched. Chloe walked in around 10:30 with Felicity, Sarah, and Jessica. All of them dressed for a nightclub rather than any kind of empowerment meeting. I watched Felicity lead them to a booth where two guys were already waiting. Watched my wife slide into the seat next to a man who immediately put his arm around her shoulders. She laughed at something he said, touched his arm, leaned into him like she'd known him for years. Her wedding ring was noticeably absent. I didn't cause a scene, didn't confront her, didn't even let her see me. I just took 3 photos on my phone, finished my beer, and left. The evidence spoke louder than any argument I could have made. So, when she sat across from me that night and declared her independence, I already knew exactly what that independence looked like. I already knew I deserved better than being treated like a villain in my own marriage. Chloe wanted freedom, and I was about to show her what true freedom actually costs. The thing about watching your marriage die is that nobody tells you how quiet it gets. Chloe stopped asking where I was going when I left the house early on Saturday mornings. Stopped caring when I came home late from work. Stopped noticing that I'd moved my clothes into the guest bedroom. She was too busy planning her girls' weekend to Asheville. Too excited about her newfound freedom to realize I'd already given her all the space she'd ever need. She announced the trip on a Monday evening, barely looking up from her phone. Felicity's organizing a wellness retreat in Asheville next weekend, just us girls. Nature and healing and all that. I nodded, asked her when she'd be back, told her to have fun. She seemed almost disappointed that I didn't object, like she'd prepared an entire speech about her right to go, and I'd stolen her moment by not caring. What she didn't know was that I'd already made a decision. The week before the Asheville trip, I noticed she'd bought new luggage, expensive stuff, the kind you buy when you want to impress someone. She'd also purchased outfits I'd never seen, tags still attached, hanging in the back of her closet like secrets. I watched her pack on Friday morning before she left for work. Watched her fold clothes that cost more than our monthly grocery bill. Watched her tuck away jewelry that hadn't come from me. She left her wedding ring on the bathroom counter that morning, just sitting there next to her makeup bag like an accessory she decided didn't match her outfit. I took a photo of it. Added it to the folder on my laptop that had grown thick with evidence over the past month. That Friday afternoon, after Chloe had already left for Asheville with her friends, I did something I'd been planning for 2 weeks. I called Arthur Sullivan, a divorce attorney someone at work had recommended months ago when I first started noticing the changes but hadn't wanted to admit what they meant. I sent him everything I'd collected, every screenshot, every receipt, every photo. He called me back within an hour. "This is one of the clearest cases I've seen," he said, his voice matter of fact, but not unkind. "If you're serious about this, we can move fast." I told him I was serious. Told him I wanted to file on Monday morning. Told him I was done being someone's safety net while they practiced their high-wire act without consequences. Arthur walked me through everything I needed to do over the weekend. Move half the money from our joint accounts into a new account in my name only. Pack my essential belongings. Prepare to leave the house we'd called home for 7 years. Document everything one last time. I spent Saturday doing exactly that, methodically dismantling 7 years of shared life with the same careful attention Chloe had used to destroy our marriage. But the confirmation I needed, the final piece that erased any remaining doubt, came Saturday night around 11 o'clock. My phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was male, slurred slightly with alcohol, genuinely confused. "Hey man, is this David?" he asked. And my stomach dropped. "Yeah, who's this?" "Look, I don't want any trouble, but I'm at this bar in Asheville and there's this woman here, Chloe. She's been all over my buddy Ryan all night, and she told him she's separated from her husband." But then I saw. wedding photos on her Facebook, and I don't know. It felt wrong, man. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in the silence of my home office for a long time. This stranger, this guy who owed me absolutely nothing, had more integrity than my own wife. He didn't have to make that call, didn't have to tell me the truth. But he gave it to me anyway, because he recognized something was fundamentally wrong. This wasn't a mistake, or a misunderstanding, or a moment of weakness. This was my wife, in another city, without her wedding ring, telling strangers she was single, living a completely different life than the one she'd promised me 7 years ago. The guy on the phone had confirmed what I already knew but hadn't wanted to fully accept. Our marriage wasn't struggling. It was already over. I'd just been the last one to admit it. Sunday morning, I finalized everything with Arthur. He'd have the initial paperwork ready by Monday afternoon. I spent the rest of Sunday moving money, packing my truck with 2 suitcases of essential belongings, and preparing the letter I'd leave for Chloe. No long explanations, no emotional appeals. Just cold facts delivered with the same tone she'd used when telling me I didn't get a say in her life. Chloe came back from Asheville late Sunday night, glowing and relaxed, immediately posting photos of lakes and hiking trails that I knew were performances because I'd already heard the truth about what her weekend actually involved. She walked into our bedroom, noticed I wasn't there, and didn't even come looking for me. That absence of curiosity, that complete lack of concern for where her husband might be, told me everything I needed to know about where I ranked in her priorities. Monday morning, I went to work early, met with Arthur at 7 o'clock, and signed everything. He warned me this would get ugly, that Chloe would likely try to paint me as the villain, that her friends would rally around her and create a narrative where I was the controlling husband who couldn't handle a strong, independent woman. I told him I didn't care about the narrative. I cared about the truth, and I had mountains of evidence to prove what the truth actually was. I spent that entire day at work in a fog, going through motions, attending meetings where I heard nothing, responding to emails I'd have no memory of writing. My boss, Mark, noticed something was off, asked if I needed to take some time, but I told him I was fine. I wasn't fine, but I was determined. And sometimes determination carries you through when nothing else can. That evening, I came home before Chloe got back from whatever empowerment session she was attending. I took off my wedding ring for the first time in 7 years. Felt how light my hand suddenly was. How strange it looked without that band of gold that had marked me as someone's husband. I placed the ring on top of an envelope I'd prepared. A handwritten letter that said everything I needed to say without giving her the satisfaction of a face-to-face confrontation where she could twist my words or play the victim. The letter was simple, *, you wanted independence. You wanted freedom. You wanted a life where I didn't get a say. You have it now. The papers will be delivered Wednesday. Don't contact me. Don't try to explain. We both know what you've been doing. You're free now. I hope it's everything you wanted. *. I left the envelope on the kitchen table. The same table where she'd told me I didn't get a say in her life. The same place where I'd watched our marriage die over cold Chinese food just 4 days earlier. I took one last look at the house, at the photos on the walls of a couple that didn't exist anymore, at the life I'd built with someone who decided it wasn't enough. Then I walked out the door, got in my truck, and drove to the extended stay hotel I'd booked for the next 2 months. My phone started ringing around 9:30 that night. Chloe's name lit up the screen 23 times before I turned the phone off completely. She left voicemails I'd never listened to, sent texts I'd never read, tried to reach me through social media I'd already blocked her on. But I was done being the person she could manipulate. Done being the safety net for someone who wanted to jump without consequences. I'd given her exactly what she asked for, and now she'd have to live with it. Chloe spent the first week after I left trying every possible way to reach me. And when that didn't work, she deployed her support system. Her sister, Emily, called me 8 times in 2 days, leaving voicemails that escalated from confused to angry, talking about how I was being cruel and unreasonable and throwing away 7 years over nothing. Her mother, Susan, sent me a text message that was 4 paragraphs long about family values and working through problems and how disappointed she was that I'd given up so easily. Even Felicity tried to reach out through LinkedIn, of all places, sending me a message about how I was proving every toxic masculine pattern she'd warned Chloe about. How real men don't abandon their wives during periods of growth. I didn't respond to any of them, because there was nothing left to say. Arthur had the divorce papers delivered to the house on Wednesday morning. And according to the process server, Chloe answered the door in her bathrobe, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She signed for the documents, read the first page, and apparently sat down on the front steps and cried for half an hour. Our neighbor, Carol, told me this later, said she'd never seen someone look so completely shattered. Said she tried to comfort Chloe, but got pushed away. Part of me felt bad, for about 10 seconds, and then I remembered the Instagram photos, the lies, the wedding ring abandoned on bathroom counters, the man in Asheville who she'd told she was separated from. You don't get to destroy something and then cry when you realize it's actually broken. The legal process moved faster than I expected, because Chloe didn't contest anything. Arthur said that was highly unusual. Said most divorces drag on for months with fights over assets and accusations and attempts to hurt each other through the legal system. But Chloe signed everything he put in front of her within days. Agreed to the 50-50 division of assets. Didn't ask for alimony, even though North Carolina law might have given her some. Arthur thought maybe she felt guilty, but I knew better. She wasn't feeling guilty. She was feeling abandoned. And there's a critical difference. Guilt means you recognize what you did wrong and want to make it right. Abandonment means you're upset someone stopped tolerating it and you've lost your safety net. About a month after the papers were served, I ran into Sarah at the grocery store near my new apartment. She was alone, looked exhausted, had that particular weariness that comes from maintaining a lifestyle you can't actually afford. She saw me, froze for a second like she was deciding whether to run, and then walked over with purpose. You really did it, she said. Not quite accusatory, but definitely not friendly. You just left her. I looked at her carefully. This woman who'd encouraged my wife to blow up her marriage, who cheered every boundary violation like it was some kind of victory. She made her choices, Sarah, I said. I made mine. Sarah shook her head, started to walk away, then turned back. Felicity said you'd be like this. Said men can't handle women who know their worth. I almost laughed, because the script was so predictable, so rehearsed. Is that what you tell yourself about your ex-husband? That he couldn't handle your worth? Or did he just get tired of financing a jewelry business that never sold anything while you blamed him for not being supportive enough? Her face went red and she walked away without another word. I felt bad for maybe 5 seconds. Then I remembered that these were the people who'd poisoned my marriage, who'd convinced my wife that independence meant destruction, that freedom meant betrayal, that empowerment required burning down everything stable in her life. They didn't get my sympathy or my patience. The empowerment circle fell apart completely about 6 weeks after that encounter. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Jessica had gotten engaged again, this time to a guy she'd known for less than a month. And when Felicity suggested she slow down and focus on her personal growth first, Jessica had told her to mind her own business and stop projecting her failures onto everyone else. Sarah apparently stopped coming to meetings after her landlord started eviction proceedings and she couldn't afford to keep up appearances anymore. And Felicity, the great leader and architect of so much destruction, had simply moved on to a new group of women to manipulate. A fresh set of marriages to undermine with her toxic philosophy, dressed up as feminism and empowerment. Chloe was left with nothing. No support system, no empowerment circle, no friends who actually cared about her beyond what drama she could provide for their next meeting. The divorce was finalized on a Monday morning in early September, exactly 11 minutes in front of a judge who looked profoundly bored with the whole proceeding. 7 years of marriage, all those promises and dreams and shared moments, reduced to signatures on documents and a gavel striking wood. Chloe sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with a lawyer she'd hired last minute. Someone who looked fresh out of law school and completely overwhelmed by a case that had no defense. I didn't look at her once during the entire hearing. Arthur had advised me not to engage, not to give her any emotional reaction she could potentially use against me, but honestly, I didn't look at her because I didn't want to. The woman I'd married was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. And whoever was sitting in that courtroom wasn't someone I had any connection to anymore. After the judge signed the final papers, I walked out of the courthouse into September sunshine that felt warmer than it should have for early fall. Arthur shook my hand, told me I'd handled everything with more grace and dignity than most of his clients managed, said to call him if I needed anything going forward. I thanked him, got in my truck, and drove to work like it was any other Monday. Because in a way, it was. Life doesn't stop for your grief or your relief or whatever complicated mix of emotions comes with ending a marriage that should have lasted forever but couldn't survive someone's need to destroy it. Chloe tried one more time about 2 weeks after the divorce was final. She showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning, looking smaller somehow, wearing clothes I recognized from years ago, back when she was still the person I'd married. She asked if we could talk, said she'd made terrible mistakes, said she understood now what she'd lost, and wanted a chance to explain. I stood in my doorway and looked at this woman who'd once been my whole world, who I'd have done anything for, who I'd built a life with that she'd dismantled piece by piece. I forgive you, Chloe. I really do. But forgiveness isn't reconciliation. You made choices, and those choices have consequences, and I'm not one of those consequences you get to undo. She started crying. The kind of deep sobs that shake your whole body. Asked me if there was any chance, any possibility that we could try again, that she could prove she'd changed. I shook my head slowly, feeling sad, but also certain. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope you build a life that makes you happy. But that life isn't going to include me. She left without another word. And I watched her walk to her car, get in, sit there for a minute with her head on the steering wheel, and then finally drive away. I felt genuinely sad for what we'd lost, for the future we'd planned that would never happen. But I didn't feel even a trace of regret for letting it go. You can't save someone who's determined to drown. And you shouldn't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Those aren't just sayings. They're survival strategies for situations exactly like this. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I got the promotion at work that I'd been working toward for 2 years. Mark pulled me into his office, told me he'd noticed a significant change in my focus and energy. Said I seemed more driven, more present, more engaged with my work than I'd been in a long time. I didn't tell him it was because I wasn't spending all my emotional energy trying to fix a marriage that was already dead. Wasn't walking on eggshells around someone who treated every concern like an attack. Wasn't constantly wondering what lie I'd discover next. I just thanked him, accepted the new position, and kept moving forward. I started dating again eventually. Nothing serious at first, just coffee with interesting people who didn't come with empowerment circles or toxic friends or a philosophy that independence meant destroying anyone who cared about you. It was strange at first, learning to trust again, learning to recognize red flags earlier, learning that not everyone would use therapy language as a weapon or rewrite history to cast themselves as victims. I ran into Chloe one final time, about 14 months after the divorce, at a store on a random weekday afternoon. We made eye contact across the home goods aisle. Both of us frozen for just a second. And then we both nodded slightly and kept walking in opposite directions. There was nothing left to say. No closure that needed finding, no wounds that required reopening. We'd been married once, built a life together once. And now we weren't and hadn't. And that was the complete story. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled everything, if I wish I'd fought harder or insisted on therapy or given her more chances to explain or change. I tell them the same thing every time. She told me I didn't get a say in her life, so I gave her exactly what she asked for. Freedom works both ways, and independence means living with your choices without expecting someone else to catch you when those choices lead to consequences. She wanted a life without me questioning her, without me caring where she was or who she was with, without me being part of her decisions. I gave her that gift completely. Turns out it wasn't quite the empowerment she'd imagined when Felicity was feeding her those lines about reclaiming her power. When would you have drawn the line, wondering what in the hell I'd missed while I was asleep? My name's Noah. I'm 33, an architect. And for the better part of a year before that morning, my life had been this polite, psychological nightmare. Chloe and I had been together for 5 years, engaged for 12 months. On the surface, everything looked perfect. But there was this one thing, this tiny detail everyone kept telling me was completely normal, and that I was the crazy one for having a problem with. Her ex-boyfriend, Liam. He was still in her life. And by in her life, I don't mean an occasional text or coffee once a year. I mean this guy was at every holiday dinner, every birthday party, every family gathering. He even had a key to her parents' house. When I showed Chloe the text that morning, she barely glanced at it. Just brushed it off. Oh, we went to that new wine bar in the old city last night. I told you about it. I stood there, feeling like an idiot, racking my brain, trying to remember if she had told me, wondering if I was losing my mind. Because this had become the pattern. Liam was always just there. Hovering at the edge of every single plan we made. And every single time I brought it up, I was the problem. Chloe would use words like evolved, emotionally mature, secure attachment style. And her parents, both former therapists, would back her up with phrases about examining my insecurity and unpacking my outdated masculinity. I swear, her mom, Sarah, actually said that to me at Thanksgiving. Right after Liam helped himself to seconds of the turkey I'd brought. Her dad, David, just nodded along, like I was some fascinating case study. I felt less like a fiancé and more like a patient they were all analyzing. The thing is, I'm not a jealous guy. Never have been. My exes and I parted on good terms. I genuinely didn't care if Chloe had male friends. But Liam wasn't just a friend. He was everywhere. And the boundaries I tried to set? They were treated like personal failings I needed to work through in therapy. Chloe's parents had this way of making every conversation feel like an intervention, where I was the one who needed fixing. And after a while, I started to doubt myself. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you insists you're wrong, and you actually start to believe them, even though your gut is screaming otherwise? My own parents, James and Maria, they didn't say much when I'd mention it. But I'd catch my mom's face sometimes, this tight expression like she was biting back words. My dad would just squeeze my shoulder and change the subject. They're not confrontational people. They didn't want to interfere, but I could feel their concern, like a weight in the room. Meanwhile, at Chloe's family events, Liam would be sitting right there at the main table. Not off with the extended family, not with casual friends, but with us. The core group. And everyone acted like this was totally normal. He'd been her boyfriend for 3 years before me. They'd broken up mutually, according to Chloe, stayed friends, and her parents loved him so much they'd basically adopted him as a bonus son. I'd watch him laugh at inside jokes with David, help Sarah in the kitchen, play with her younger sister's kids, and I'd think, am I insane, or is this really weird? Chloe would catch me looking and later tell me I seemed tense, or ask if I was feeling insecure again, and I'd end up apologizing. The gaslighting was so smooth, so polished, I didn't even recognize it as gaslighting until way too late. It was all dressed up in therapy language, in concern for my emotional growth. And I fell for it, because I wanted to be a good partner. I wanted to be evolved and mature and secure. So I swallowed my discomfort, over and over. And Liam kept showing up. He was at her birthday dinner, 2 seats down from me. He was on the family vacation to their cabin, sleeping in the guest room while I shared Chloe's childhood bedroom with her. He was at Christmas, opening presents with the family while I smiled and pretended this was fine. Every time I tried to talk to Chloe about it privately, she'd flip it back on me, asking why I was so threatened by her friendship, or saying it was really about my own issues with trust. And her parents would somehow hear about it and call me to check in, which really meant lecture me about healthy relationship dynamics. I started keeping my mouth shut, telling myself it was just until the wedding. That once we were married, things would naturally shift, and Liam would fade into the background. I was wrong. 3 months before the wedding, we had this dinner scheduled with both families at an expensive restaurant in the old city. One of those places with cloth napkins and a wine list thicker than a phone book. We were supposed to finalize wedding details. Chloe had made the reservation, insisted on inviting her parents, and I brought mine because I figured it was only fair. We were going to go over the seating chart, the timeline, the final head count, all the little things. And I was actually feeling optimistic that night. I thought we were finally moving forward. I should have known something was off when we arrived, and there was an extra chair at our table. My mom noticed at first, she's observant like that. After we'd ordered and the waiter brought the wine, she asked, in this perfectly polite voice, "Chloe, honey, why is Liam seated at the family table?" The temperature in that room dropped about 40 degrees. I swear I could feel it. And Chloe's face went hard in a way I'd only seen a few times before. She looked at my mom like she'd just said something unforgivably rude and snapped back that he was family, and she would think that would be obvious by now. I jumped in, trying to smooth things over, said something diplomatic about how we just didn't know he was coming tonight. And that's when Chloe's parents joined in. Sarah leaned forward with this condescending smile and told me, "Noah, we've talked about this before. Your resistance to Liam is really about your own rigid thinking." And David added that it was a common pattern they saw all the time in couples therapy. This fear of your partner having connections outside the relationship. I felt my face get hot, not from anger, but from humiliation. Because they were doing it again. Turning my completely reasonable boundary into a psychological defect, and doing it in front of my parents. My mom's hand tightened around her fork. My dad put his hand on her arm, a silent message to stay quiet. And I realized they'd been watching this happen for months, staying silent because I'd asked them not to interfere. Chloe was on a roll now. She started talking louder, saying things about how my family was stuck in the past and unable to accept modern relationship dynamics. And I watched my mom's face crumble, just a little bit. And something in me snapped. Not in a loud way, not in a dramatic way, but in this quiet, final way where I just knew I was done. Then Chloe stood up. And I mean fully stood up from the table so everyone in the restaurant could hear her. And she said, "Liam will be at our wedding. He'll be at our holidays. He'll be at our children's events. And if you can't accept that, Noah, then you shouldn't marry me." The whole restaurant went quiet. I could feel people staring. The waiter had frozen halfway through opening a bottle of wine at the next table. Chloe was looking at me with this expression that was half challenge and half certainty that I'd back down. Her parents were nodding like she'd just said something profound. My parents were staring at their plates. And I felt this weird calm wash over me. I stood up slowly, pushed my chair back, and said in the most level voice I could manage, "You're right. I shouldn't marry you. So I won't." Then I looked at my parents and told them we were leaving. And we walked out of that restaurant while Chloe was still standing there with her mouth open. We didn't say anything until we got to the parking lot. And then my mom just hugged me. And my dad said, "We're proud of you, son." And I realized that 5 years had just ended in one sentence. And all I felt was relief. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house. And for the first time in a year, I didn't have that knot in my stomach, wondering what boundary I'd be expected to ignore that day. My phone had been going off since around midnight, dozens of calls and texts from Chloe, her parents, even some of her friends who'd apparently heard what happened and wanted to tell me I was making a huge mistake. I didn't answer any of them. I just turned off my phone and went downstairs where my mom had coffee waiting and my dad was reading the newspaper like it was any other morning. They didn't ask if I was okay, or if I wanted to talk about it. They just let me sit there in silence. And that's exactly what I needed. By noon, my phone had over 60 messages. And when I finally turned it back on, scrolling through them, I realized Chloe genuinely didn't understand what she'd done wrong. Her text started with confusion, asking why I'd embarrassed her like that. Then they moved to anger, saying I'd humiliated her family and made a scene over nothing. And finally, they landed on this weird mix of therapy speak and accusations, telling me I was sabotaging our relationship because I was afraid of commitment. Her mom sent me a long message about how I was displaying avoidant attachment behaviors and should really consider individual counseling. Her dad sent something shorter but equally condescending about how walking away from conflict was emotionally immature. Not one of them acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, giving me an ultimatum in front of both our families about her ex-boyfriend being a permanent fixture in our marriage was the actual problem. I didn't respond to any of it. I just started making calls about the wedding. The venue was the first one. And when I explained I needed to cancel, the coordinator got really quiet, then asked if I was sure because we'd lose the entire deposit. I told her I was sure. I told her to send the bill to Chloe's parents since they'd insisted on paying for the venue as their gift. Then I called the caterer, the florist, the DJ, the photographer. I went down the entire list, methodically canceling everything. Some were sympathetic, some were annoyed about the late notice. But I didn't care anymore. I just wanted it done. The photographer actually thanked me for calling so early because she just had another booking request for that date. And I remember thinking, that's good. At least someone's day will work out. My best friend, Ethan, called me that afternoon. He'd been my best man and had apparently heard through the grapevine what happened. He asked if I needed him to come over, and I said no, but he showed up anyway with beer and pizza. We sat in my parents' backyard, not really talking about it, but just existing in the same space. He told me he'd never liked Chloe's family, thought they were pretentious and condescending. He'd always wondered why Liam was around so much, but figured it wasn't his place to say anything. I asked him why nobody had said anything, and he just shrugged and said, "Would you have listened a year ago?" And he was right. I wouldn't have. I'd been so deep in the fog of wanting to be the perfect progressive boyfriend that I'd ignored every red flag, every gut feeling telling me something was wrong. 3 days after the restaurant incident, Chloe showed up at my house. I'd gone back to collect some things and make sure everything was secure. She was sitting on the front steps, waiting for me. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept. And when she saw me, she immediately started crying and saying we needed to talk. I told her there was nothing to talk about, but she followed me inside anyway. And that's when I showed her the folder I'd prepared. Inside were copies of the deed to the house, showing it was solely in my name, purchased 2 years before we met. And a timeline I'd written out of when she'd moved in and what the living arrangement had been. She stared at the papers, confused, and asked what this was about. I explained calmly that since we weren't getting married, she needed to move out. I was giving her 30 days to find a new place. She looked at me like I'd slapped her and said, "You're kicking me out?" And I corrected her. "I'm not kicking you out. I'm simply ending our cohabitation now that we are no longer engaged." She tried to argue that she'd lived here for 3 years, that she had rights. And I pulled out another paper. It was the housing agreement we'd signed when she moved in, the one her lawyer dad had insisted on, actually, which clearly stated the house was mine, and she was essentially a guest. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her father's paranoia about protecting her assets had actually protected mine. Chloe completely fell apart then, dropping onto the couch and sobbing, saying she didn't understand how we got here, and couldn't we just talk about this like adults? I sat down across from her, not next to her, and asked her a simple question. Did you actually want to marry me, or did you want to marry the idea of having both me and Liam in your life forever? She got defensive immediately. Said I was twisting things, that Liam was just a friend, and she couldn't believe I was this insecure. I didn't raise my voice. I just repeated the question. And she couldn't answer it. The silence stretched out for almost a minute. And then she said something that made everything click into place. She said, "Liam wanted to get back together last year, and I said no because I was with you. Doesn't that count for anything?" I just stared at her, processing what she'd just admitted, and asked why Liam would think he had a chance if they were just friends. She started backtracking immediately, saying it wasn't like that, he just expressed feelings and she'd shut it down. But I could see the truth in her face. She'd liked the attention. Liked having two men competing for her. Liked being the center of that dynamic. And she convinced herself and everyone around her that this was normal and healthy, and I was the broken one for objecting. I stood up and told her she had until the end of the month to move out, and if she needed help finding a place, I'd be happy to give her recommendations for apartments near her parents. She started yelling then, saying I was being cruel and heartless, throwing away 5 years like it meant nothing. And I let her yell until she ran out of steam. Then I said quietly, "Chloe, you gave me an ultimatum. You told me not to marry you if I couldn't accept Liam being at every major event for the rest of our lives. And I took option 2. This isn't me throwing anything away. This is me respecting your boundary." She didn't have a response to that. She just grabbed her purse and left, slamming the door hard enough that I heard something rattle in the kitchen. I stood there in my living room, in my house, in the space I'd worked so hard to build, and felt nothing but relief that she was gone. The remaining weeks before what would have been the wedding date passed quietly, almost surreally peaceful. I used that time to focus on work, spend time with my parents, and process everything without the constant noise of Chloe's drama. My mom called me every few days to check in, never pushy, just making sure I was eating and sleeping and not spiraling. And I appreciated that she trusted me to handle this my own way. My dad sent me a text one night that just said, "Proud of you for knowing your worth." And I saved that message because it meant more than he probably knew. Chloe's parents tried calling me once, together on speakerphone. I let it go to voicemail. Sarah left this long, rambling message about how they were disappointed in my inability to work through relationship challenges and they hoped I'd eventually grow enough to understand what I'd lost. I deleted it without listening to the whole thing. I'd heard enough of their analysis to last me a lifetime. The wedding date came and went. I spent it at a drafting table in my home office, working on designs for a new project, completely at peace with my decision. My friends took me out that night, not because I was sad, but because they wanted to celebrate me finally standing up for myself. We ended up at a bar, telling stories and laughing until late. Ethan's girlfriend brought her friend, Olivia, and we talked about architecture and art and travel. Normal things. Easy things. And at no point did she mention her ex-boyfriend or make me feel like I was crazy for having boundaries. It was refreshing in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Just a simple conversation with someone who respected themselves and others enough not to play games. When I got home that night, I looked around my house, really looked at it, and realized I could finally breathe again. The space felt like mine again, not like a stage where I had to perform being okay with something I wasn't okay with. And I knew walking away had been the right choice. 6 months after the breakup, I was standing in the lobby of a boutique hotel in Rome, looking at gaudy sketches on the wall, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought about Chloe. I'd taken 3 weeks off work, my first real vacation in years, and spent it traveling through Italy and Greece, looking at architecture, visiting museums, eating at small local restaurants, and just existing without anyone questioning my boundaries or analyzing my emotional state. It was the first time since the engagement that I felt like myself again. Not the version of me that was constantly trying to prove I was secure and evolved. Just Noah, architect guy, who likes buildings and good coffee and not having his ex-girlfriend's ex-boyfriend at family dinners. When I got back home, my boss pulled me into his office and told me I looked different, more relaxed. Then he offered me lead on a major commercial project in the old city that I'd been hoping to get for 2 years. The project was a mixed-use development, retail and residential, exactly the kind of challenge I loved. And I threw myself into it completely. The work was demanding but satisfying. Late nights at the drafting table, meetings with contractors and city planners, site visits where I could see the design coming to life in real space and real materials. My team was great, enthusiastic, and talented. and for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually building something instead of just managing someone else's emotional chaos. About 2 months into the project, a professional architecture journal reached out, wanting to feature our work in their spring issue. And when the article came out, with my name as lead architect and photos of the preliminary designs, my parents framed it and hung it in their living room. My mom called me crying happy tears. And my dad sent me a text that just said, "Always knew you had it in you." And I felt this deep sense of pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's validation. I'd proven to myself that I could walk away from something that wasn't right and build something better, both literally and metaphorically. I ran into Chloe about 10 months after the breakup, completely by accident, at a coffee shop near my office. I was picking up my usual order, not paying attention, and turned around and almost crashed right into her. She looked different, thinner maybe, and her hair was shorter. For a second, we just stared at each other with that awkward recognition of people who used to share a life. She said hi first. Asked how I was doing. I said fine, asked her the same. She told me she was living with her parents temporarily while she looked for a place, and I nodded politely. Then she asked if I was seeing anyone. And I told her I'd been on a few dates, but nothing serious, which was true. I'd matched with a few women on apps and had pleasant enough evenings, but I wasn't rushing into anything. She looked like she wanted to say more. Opened her mouth and closed it a few times. And finally asked if we could talk sometime, really talk. I thought about it for a second and then said honestly that I didn't think there was anything left to talk about. We both made our choices and moved on, I told her. I hope you're doing well, but I don't see the point in rehashing the past. She nodded slowly, eyes getting watery, and said she understood. And then she left. I watched her walk out and waited for some feeling to hit. Sadness, or regret, or even anger. But there was nothing. Just a mild sense of that was awkward, and relief when she was gone. The complete absence of emotion told me everything I needed to know about whether ending things had been the right call. A few weeks after that, I started seeing someone new. Not from the apps, but through a friend of a friend at a gallery opening. Her name was Olivia. She was a structural engineer. And the first time we talked, she spent 20 minutes passionately explaining why cantilever design was underutilized in residential architecture. And I was completely charmed. She was direct and honest and didn't play games. If she wanted to see me, she said so. If she needed space, she said that too. And the simplicity of it was almost shocking after years of trying to decode Chloe's therapy language. Olivia met my parents after about 2 months, and my mom pulled me aside later and whispered, "I like this one. She's straightforward." And I realized that was exactly what had been missing before. On what would have been my first wedding anniversary, I was at a construction site, looking at foundation work for the project. Hard hat on, blueprints in hand, talking through drainage solutions with the site manager. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder I'd forgotten to delete, wedding anniversary. I dismissed it without a second thought. That evening, Olivia came over and cooked dinner at my place. We ate on the couch watching a documentary about Japanese architecture. And at some point, she fell asleep with her head on my shoulder. And I just sat there thinking about how easy this felt. No drama. No triangulation. No one making me feel crazy for wanting a normal relationship. Just two people who liked each other and respected each other, building something together at their own pace. I never heard from Liam. Never saw him around town. And honestly, didn't care where he ended up, or whether he and Chloe finally got together like they probably both wanted all along. That part of my life was closed. A chapter I'd finished and shelved. I had no interest in reopening it. My friends stopped asking if I was okay, or if I regretted my decision. They could see I was genuinely better, happier, more present in my own life. Ethan told me one night over drinks that watching me walk out of that restaurant was one of the most decisive things he'd ever seen. And I laughed and said it hadn't felt decisive in the moment. It had felt necessary. Looking back now, almost a year later, I can see that walking away wasn't giving up, or running from conflict, or any of the things Chloe's parents accused me of. It was choosing myself, and my boundaries, and my right to a relationship where I didn't come in third place behind my partner and her ex. I built a good life after that dinner. A life that feels solid and real and mine. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not even the fantasy version of what Chloe and I might have been if she'd been willing to actually choose me. Some people called me cold for how quickly I moved on. But they didn't see the year of slow erosion before that. The constant gaslighting and boundary violations that had already killed what we had. By the time I walked out of that restaurant, I'd already done my grieving. I'd already tried everything I could think of to make it work. And all that was left was the final acknowledgement that it never would. Have you ever had to walk away from something you thought you wanted, only to find true peace on the other side? When she'd moved in and what the living arrangement had been. She stared at the papers, confused, and asked what this was about. I explained calmly that since we weren't getting married, she needed to move out. I was giving her 30 days to find a new place. She looked at me like I'd slapped her and said, "You're kicking me out?" And I corrected her. "I'm not kicking you out. I'm simply ending our cohabitation now that we are no longer engaged." She tried to argue that she'd lived here for 3 years, that she had rights. And I pulled out another paper. It was the housing agreement we'd signed when she moved in, the one her lawyer dad had insisted on, actually, which clearly stated the house was mine, and she was essentially a guest. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her father's paranoia about protecting her assets had actually protected mine. Chloe completely fell apart then, dropping onto the couch and sobbing, saying she didn't understand how we got here, and couldn't we just talk about this like adults? I sat down across from her, not next to her, and asked her a simple question.